Hi, I'm Deboki and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I'm going to be reviewing The Overstory by Richard Powers. I'm going to be honest, I feel a little bit inadequate when it comes to reviewing this book, but in a way where it kind of makes me feel I actually really do need to review it, and a lot of that inadequacy comes down to the fact that this is basically not the sort of book I usually read. The Overstory is a literary fiction novel, and it's about trees. Honestly, if you wanted to describe this book in as few words as possible, trees would be plenty. It would be almost more than enough. The book is structured in a tree-inspired fashion. It starts with the roots, which is basically there to set up our main non-tree characters. There are immigrant families that are laying roots in America. There are families that are contending with tragedy. There are couples that are coming together. There are couples that are falling apart. There are individuals who are surviving horrible things. And throughout this section, we see the beginnings of their relationships and sometimes non-relationships with trees. From roots, we go to trunk to crown to seed. The stories build and converge and branch off again as characters' lives intersect, sometimes in immediate physical ways and sometimes through more abstract means. One set of characters gets into environmental activism, another set understands more about trees and the world through science and technology, and others have just, more mundane human stories that seem informed by everything else going on. But the key is that the book is about the trees and understanding them better as a living thing. So when I say that this is the kind of book that I don't usually read, what I'm talking about is the fact that this is a literary fiction novel that is driven first and foremost by ideas. It's not really a book that you're going to describe in terms of its plot or its characters. You really describe it in terms of the ideas that Powers is trying to flesh out in the form of a novel. And I love ideas and themes, don't get me wrong, give me all your ideas and themes, but when it comes to fiction, I'm more interested in seeing how they arise from characters and plot rather than the other way around. And just more broadly, The Overstory is the exact kind of book that I can't read without being deeply self-conscious about the fact that I'm reading it. Whenever I finish a sentence, I'm immediately thinking about whether or not I'm extracting all of the meaning and interpretation out of it. And if I'm not, then obviously I must be doing something wrong. And I don't think that any of that is true. I hope not. Maybe it is. I don't know. But I think it's mostly about my own sense of inadequacy again, which is, like I said, why I'm making this video. I feel the only way for me to actually work through that sense of inadequacy is to just establish my opinions out loud. But I also don't think I'm going to be building to a definite conclusion in this video. I mean, I know I'm not building to a definite conclusion in this video because I've scripted it ahead of time. But really what I'm going to be building to is a question, and it might be a dumb one, but I can't let go of it. The reason why I decided to give it a chance, even though I had that feeling of I don't think this is for me, the reason why I decided to give it a chance is because I had seen a lot of science writers, and particularly people who write about climate change, talk about how meaningful they found this book as an example of something that uses fiction to explain nature and, even to talk about climate crises in a way that nonfiction might not be able to, particularly because when it comes to factual nonfiction representations of science, there is a lot to consider about how you represent things like trees and whether you can anthropomorphize it. And this is a thing in science and science writing that I think is not clear cut, and it's really hard to balance. So for reference, if you're new to my channel, I am a science writer, and like a lot of science writers, I also used to be a scientist. So this tension between wanting to bring life to the amazing things that we see in nature and science without, over attributing some kind of a personhood to them is a thing I've seen both from the research side and from the communication side. In Barbara Kingsolver's review of The Overstory for the New York Times, she starts with this list of all the many myriad wondrous things that you might not know about trees. And then she goes on to say, quote, "It may register as a shock then that trees have lives so much like our own. All the behaviors described above have been studied and documented by scientists who carefully avoid the word behavior and other anthropomorphic language, lest they be accused of having emotional attachments to their subjects." I think there's more to it than just the desire to avoid looking over-attached to something. I think there's really a more subtle thing going on about making sure we're not just processing everything around us solely in the terms that we use to understand ourselves, even though of course the ways that we are processing everything around us is fully informed by the way that we understand ourselves. But I think her overall point is still true, and I think this tension becomes tougher when we're trying to communicate science, not just to like explain the world around us and talk about how nature works, but when we're actually trying to make arguments for how we as humans need to be behaving in nature, how we need to be interacting with it, whether that's as individuals or as societies. I think one of the quotes that I've seen kind of gain the most traction from the Overstory comes from a psychologist character named Adam, who says, quote, "The best arguments in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story." Story is not just the purview of fiction, but I think what Kingsolver is getting to in her review overall that parallels what I think other science writers have like found in this novel is the sense that fiction can let you tell a story about trees that nonfiction can't. In the Overstory, Powers is using his fiction license to take what we know about trees, whether that's disease or things like how they communicate chemically, and he combines that with a sense of this like invisible and almost like mythological persona that makes the trees feel fully alive in a way that we think of ourselves being alive, which combines consciousness and purpose and a conversation with us. And the sections where he's talking about trees are really stunning. In the beginning of this book, Powers describes the blight that decimated American chestnut trees, and he brings this sense of movement to a blight that is basically just like invisible hopping between trees. He's basically taking like a car chase scene where all the cars are completely still, and he's imbuing it with like a sense of action and stakes that makes it heartbreaking when you realize what this disease has done to a species of trees that I'm guessing like for most of us, we probably hadn't heard about before we opened this book. When I think about what I enjoyed about this book, that passage and so many other ones like that are really what I think about. From talking to friends who have read this book and from reading a lot of reviews of it, it really seems like these tree descriptions are like so core to like what has resonated with people. It feels almost cliche to describe it in this way, but I think the feeling you get coming out of this book is that like you look at the trees around you differently. But aside from that feeling, I had this really weird experience reading this book where when I was reading it, I had a really hard time putting it down. But when I wasn't reading it, I had a really hard time picking it up. I just never felt like reading it unless I was already reading it. And I think that all comes down to the fact that like outside of the trees, I cared very little about what was going on in this book. I've been reading a lot of reviews of the Overstory just to see kind of like where my feelings about it fit overall. And the thing that I have seen a lot of criticism of in general are his characters, which is to say that like one of the main criticisms is that his characters feel less like characters and more like ideas rendered into like the semblance of a human form. I've also seen some reviews that say that compared to his previous work, the Overstory has characters that actually feel kind of like more like actual characters than his usual fare. If that's the case, then I'm not really sure that Powers' work in general is for me, because I really struggled with the characters in this book. In a review for Book Forum, Victoria Baena has this more charitable read on all of this, where she notes that like, you know, in the Overstory, the book is still quite interested in ideas over characters, but quote, "There is something more going on. Here the ideas have a living, humming force of their own. They're alive, almost like full-bodied characters in themselves. The book is interested, that is, in how people become interested, how the books they read, the people they meet, and the conversations they have cause them to change their minds or their lives." I haven't read any of Powers' other novels, so I can't say anything about how this statement like actually holds up, but I do see it in the context of this book. But I still can't get past how thin these characters and their journeys feel overall. At worst, some of these characters are just like painfully described. For me, one of the worst was Nile Mantha. He's like this CEO, gamer, coder guy, and he's created this immensely popular game, but he's also really frustrated by the ways that people have interacted with it. Mantha's grown up in a Hindu family, and anytime he was on the page, I felt like I needed to do like some kind of like drinking game where I would like take a shot anytime there was like a reference to like a multi-armed deity or some kind of other tacked on image of like something vaguely Hindu. It reminded me a lot of this time when I was like 11, and I was like, I think it was like after like a karate class or something, and some like 20-year-old dude like just sat down next to me and was like, "Hey, you're Indian?" Like, "Hey, I took a meditation class once," and like then proceeded to talk at me about like chakras for the next 10 minutes, and I was like, "I don't know, I'm 11, my dude." Like, I don't know what you want from me. I think there's probably like kind of like a cheap reading of the inclusion of these images to be had about like cycles of life and death, which is like, you know, sort of built into the structure of this book, and it's like also part of the Hindu view of the world. There might even be like a more interesting, deeper reading into like all of these references that I'm missing. Whatever the point, the execution felt like I was sitting in the living room of like a worldly white guy who traveled to India once and had decorated his house accordingly. But that is like my own personal response to something that I think is like necessarily going to grate personally. What's more egregious is, as Baena notes again in her review, quote, amid the large cast of characters, both human and non-human, Indigenous and Black histories are glaringly absent. It's an omission that is all the more disappointing in a novel that urges us to imagine all kinds of stories as intricately, if invisibly, linked. So much of this book is about the destructive effects of capitalism on nature, but given how far this book goes in establishing roots, the lack of Indigenous stories is really striking, given that both society and nature in America has, you know, been shaped by settler colonialism. And the lack of any real examination of this history continues into like the more recent elements of the book, where like the environmental activism that's being carried out by like this group, like that group seems to be mostly white. And it felt like particularly striking to me. Like I cannot pretend that I have like a very like extensive knowledge of environmental activism, but to me some of the most prominent recent examples of environmental activism include like, you know, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, which were started by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. You could possibly make the argument that like some of these characters are not like textually on the page written to be white, but given the self-consciousness with which the Chinese American and the Indian American character are written, I kind of feel comfortable saying they are. And with the characters that are presented, I mostly didn't care, and I don't think the book is very invested in me caring either. It's very readable, which is why I couldn't like stop reading it when I was reading it, but the people feel almost incidental. Like they're there because they need to be, not because anyone actually wants them to be there. And because the characters are the source of the story, I was also just not very invested in the story. I was mostly interested in the trees and learning more about the trees. And this leads to my big dumb question about the Overstory. What is the point of the fiction? And so you might now be like, well, Devoki, I'm confused. I thought way back, like in the beginning of this video, which now probably feels like ages ago, you had this whole thing about how you can use fiction to talk about nature and science in a way that you can't with nonfiction. And like, sure, but I think this is like also where I'm a little bit uncertain, because I don't feel convinced that the fiction brought something to this book about trees that I couldn't get from like a really exciting and experimental piece of nonfiction. We don't need to be so rigid about how nonfiction works that it doesn't allow for more creative interpretations of nature with the right context. But I think there's an element again to this idea that what people need is a story, and that they might expect more of that story out of a piece of fiction, especially an acclaimed piece of fiction coming from an acclaimed writer. But it almost feels like too cynical of an answer, because what that means to me is like that the fiction is almost more of a marketing tool. Like it's about a way to get people to read about trees, even if they don't realize that they want to read about trees. And I guess that might be part of it, but I don't think that's like completely the plan here either. But I'm not asking this question because I think there's like one simple answer to it. I mean, the simplest answer of all is just that Richard Powers wanted to write this book in this way, and that meant including fiction. But I think for me, and like where I'm at with this book, I would have loved to have just read a version of it that was like the short story collection of this novel, like almost like that beginning roots section where like I didn't have to have a long-term investment in characters who I really only had like a short-term interest in, and that was able to explore a greater array of trees and science in its own anthropomorphized way. But of course my wishlist version of the Overstory means doing away with that tree structure that feels kind of vital to like the intentions of this book. And I guess more importantly, my questions and suggestions and frustrations about this book and its goals seem pretty quaint, given that this book has been read by a lot of people and it seems pretty successful in resonating with them and getting them to see trees differently and getting them to wonder more about how trees around us and how all of these things in nature are connected to our lives. But I keep going back to that idea of a good story changing a person's mind better than a good argument can. And I mean, at the end of the day, I don't feel like this book had a good story, but I felt like it had an amazing argument, and that argument seems to have changed a lot of people's minds. So thank you guys for watching. If you have thoughts about the Overstory, if you want to argue with me, I welcome your arguments. If you want to explain to me why this book is actually great and all of my questions are meaningless, I welcome that. Please don't call me an idiot, because I probably already think I'm an idiot about this book. So like, I don't know, be kind here. It's hard for all of us to read a book where we're kind of like, did I get it? You know? But I totally am like excited to talk to people about this book, because I think it's a really interesting book, whatever all these other things and feelings I have about it. So thank you guys for watching, and bye. But I think for me, and like where I am at with this, shut the fuck up, birds. Nature fucking sucks.